Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 29, and what we see is lots of revolution, revolt, and kind of changing norms and morals within societies around the world. The first we're going to take a look at is the sexual revolution that takes place during this time period. We start to see countries around the world, Sweden is used as our example, that begin to legalize things like homosexuality, begin teaching things like sexual education. Here in America, gay rights becomes more of an issue, starting in California and spreading throughout the rest of America. Birth control becomes more readily available for females and allows them to take a little bit more control of their sexuality. Even something like Playboy magazine, which comes out in the 1950s but becomes a bit more mainstream by the 1960s. Again, this idea of kind of a young, modern male, here's what to look at, here's how to dress, here's kind of the norms of that society. Again, all this is changing during that time period. Another thing we see change during this time period is really the use of drugs, right? We see this beginning on college campuses where marijuana is frequently being used. So yes, college kids actually do in fact smoke marijuana. But there are some other drugs that come on the scene, things like LSD, which begins as kind of a government experiment to see a kind of a truth serum of sorts, see if you could give it to people and have them tell you things. But again, people get their hands on and begin to experiment with hallucinogenics in this fashion. Education really begins to change during this time period as well. More and more people are able to go to college. France is a great example of this. In 1950, only 4.5% of young people attended college. By 1965, that number's up to 14.5% of young people in France are going to college. Here in America, we see a major boom in college education, as well as many former soldiers are able to take advantage of the GI Bill. Again, you have a much more college-educated society because of this. And as we start to get that next wave of college student in the 60s and then the 70s, we see that a lot of these young people start to protest and complain on campus. And that's really where we see most of these revolts or kind of ideas of toppling society or changing things for the better really start to come about. Again, these young people are kind of craving their spot in society and figuring out what that spot is going to be. Also during this time, we see kind of a female revolution, the feminist movement, as we would call it. And again, it's really a push for legal and political equality, right? So again, women are treated differently under the law. Women are treated different within that society. And again, working to change that, working to bring that equality to the forefront. A woman by the name of Betty Friedman actually writes a book called The Feminine Mystique during this time period, which talks about what is expected of women and why that's not a good thing, right? You're supposed to be a housewife and raise the kids and be seen but not heard, and why that never allows women to kind of fulfill their potential. What they could possibly be is because they're shoved in this box and they're limited as to what they can do. So again, we start to see that female revolution come about as well. Another major thing, and specifically here in America, although this does happen around the world, we start to see anti-war protests. Specifically here in America, we're seeing anti-war protests because of our involvement in Vietnam. But this really does become a worldwide protest. You see college students protesting in Britain and Italy and other European countries because of the American involvement in Vietnam. Now, a lot of this draws media attention, right? Young people, they're doing crazy things. Maybe they're burning something. They're having a protest. So again, they're getting themselves on TV. They're getting a name for themselves. So again, if that's the goal, it is successful. But there is a problem here in that there's a backlash, right? Many older Americans are looking at this and seeing these college students as spoiled, entitled, brats, right? So again, there is that kind of backlash within the generations. The worst incident we see when it comes to protesting here in America takes place at Kent State University, just down the road from us. In 1970, 4 college students are shot by the Ohio National Guard as they protested America's involvement in Vietnam. Also around the world, we're going to take a look at the Soviet Union and see what is happening there. Remember, Brezhnev takes power in 1964 after pushing Khrushchev out. And what we see is a level of détente with America. And we're going to talk a little bit here in the future about what exactly détente means. But this kind of chilling of the Cold War allows the Soviet Union to really focus on their economy, and it actually is incredibly successful. When it comes to heavy industry, steel, concrete, building type materials, they're actually outproducing the United States, right? So again, in some ways, this is actually working, but there are some underlying issues that are going to cause problems in the future. We see a large level of laziness, apathy, drunkenness becomes the norm in many of these countries. Again, everyone is assigned a job. You're not doing what you're passionate about, you're not doing what you're interested in, you're just assigned a job. So who really cares if you do it well? You literally can't be fired because they legally have to employ you. So again, you really lose your incentive to be good at your job, and it leads to all kinds of problems. Additionally, there are some bad harvests. We have droughts, we have floods, and the Soviet Union actually has to turn to the West to buy crops to simply feed the citizens of their country. And one of the countries that they purchase from is actually the United States. So even though we are enemies, we're still in the midst of the Cold War, we are actually selling them product because money pretty much trumps everything else. And again, the Soviet Union is going to see a decline, and really by the 1980s, they're hurting extremely bad. 1985, a guy named Gorbachev is going to come to power, and he really starts to change some of these issues and really kind of gets them back on their feet. But at that point in time, it's almost too late. Again, we'll learn about that in future chapters as well. Now, throughout the rest of Eastern Europe, which again is kind of under the control of the Soviet Union, we do see them releasing their grip a little bit. For example, in Poland, labor unions are able to be formed. The Catholic Church is still a major player within that country, where we don't necessarily see that in other European countries as well. The country of Hungary allows small businesses to operate. They give out license. It's referred to as communism with a capitalist facelift, right? So again, these countries realize that economically speaking, they're falling very far behind their European counterparts, that the citizens are being, kind of behind. We see these revolts going on. So again, this is kind of a way to give people a little bit, and hopefully that tides them over. Over in Czechoslovakia in 1968, we see some small reforms. We're going to push this for more. It's kind of like the story if you give a mouse a cookie, right? Once you give people a little bit of freedom, once they have that taste, once they can experience those things, they're going to want it all, right? Who's going to be satisfied with a little bit of freedom when you could have all the freedom? But again, the Soviet Union is not going to accept this. There's not going to be widespread, removal of communistic ideas or leaving the Soviet bloc or anything like that. So again, the Soviet army is used to crush this revolt that is going on in Czechoslovakia called the Prague Spring. East Germany and Romania are kind of the staunchest communist countries in Eastern Europe at this time. Both of them have essentially dictators in place that rule with an iron fist. They also have extremely powerful secret police organizations that collect information on citizens. And again, if you're a citizen in that country, you never want to say anything or do anything that's going to come off as anti-communist, because you're literally going to disappear in the middle of the night and never be seen again. So again, through fear and intimidation, they're able to really keep kind of the reins on any kind of revolt that might be going on in their country. Some other changes throughout Europe, kind of getting away or moving over to Western Europe. We really see the economies moving forward at a quick pace. Again, from the end of World War II, the Marshall Plan, America's helping them rebuild. And again, the economies of Western Europe really begin to take off. But by the mid-1970s, they become incredibly stagnant. And in fact, unemployment has grown in many of these countries to over 12%. So again, you start to see this kind of backlash from the citizens in those countries, right? Like if you run the country and now it's not doing well, we want to see change. And what we see is in Western Germany and in Great Britain, we really see the politics shifting from a kind of right-leaning conservative to a much more socialist, left-leaning kind of politics. And again, it's going to bounce back and forth between those two ideologies over the next 20, 30 years. But again, we do see a lot more of this idea of kind of left-leaning welfare state type programs being implemented in Europe, which again is very similar to what we see today. The one country that seems to have the biggest issues and then makes the biggest swing is going to be France. So again, we have a very bad economy, and this is going to lead to growth of the Socialist Party within the country until eventually it's the predominant party and they're able to put their guy in charge. Now, once in power, they implement things like wage and cost freezes. They expand the social welfare programs, and they begin to nationalize the banking and heavy industry within the country. And again, that is simply where the government takes that over. It's not a private individual owning that business and a private individual making profit. The country is now going to run that business, and the country is going to get the profit, and then that profit's going to be redistributed to people. And it's not necessarily that they're going to give you cash, but they're going to provide you with services, right? So we're going to see wages increase. We're going to see more social welfare programs. And again, all of this can happen because these industries are nationalized. But what we find is that when a government runs a business, they don't tend to run it as well. And within 3 years, a lot of these businesses that got nationalized are actually going to be reverted back into private enterprises. It's simply more efficient to have a person or an entity running that business and turning a profit and then simply taxing them than it is for the government to actually try to run that business themselves. Now, back here in America, we see kind of an interesting change in politics. We see the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. And one of the reasons why he's able to come to power is because of all those revolts and protests that are going on in America. Again, he offers America kind of this idea of a return to normal, kind of this idea of a strong leader. We're not going to let these things happen. And again, that's really appealing to the American people at that time. And he does follow through on many of his promises. For example, he assures us he's going to get us out of Vietnam, and by 1973, our troops have left. But the longer Nixon is in the White House, the more paranoid Richard Nixon becomes, which is going to lead to the Watergate incident, where he may or may not have, we don't actually know how much he knows, hired people, employed them, asked them to break into the Watergate Hotel, which is where the Democratic Party kept a lot of their files. And again, the idea was to tap phones potentially, steal documents. And again, it's a really high level of paranoia when you consider Richard Nixon couldn't even be reelected, right? This is happening in his second term. There is literally no reason to care what the Democratic Party is doing. You're only going to be the president for 2 more years. But Nixon doesn't even make it those 2 years because the writing is on the wall. He's definitely going to be impeached, and he probably becomes the first president to actually get fired from the job. So in 1974, he is going to resign, which leads to his vice president taking over, a guy by the name of Gerald Ford. Unfortunately, if you're Gerald Ford, you take over when the economy begins to tank. We have high inflation, we have high unemployment, and again, if you're in the White House and the economy does bad, the fingers are going to point at you. You are not going to keep your job for long, and that's exactly what happened in 1976. He loses to Jimmy Carter. But again, Jimmy Carter is kind of inheriting this mess of an economy. There's also an oil embargo that starts. Have you ever seen those kind of visuals? Literally just cars lined up around the block just to get a small quantity of gas, because it is really genuinely hard to get your hands on. Additionally, while Carter is in office, 53 Americans are going to be taken hostage in Iran. So Iranian students have their own revolt. They overthrow the Shah of Iran. They attack the American embassy. And again, 53 people are taken hostage, and they will remain hostages during the rest of Carter's presidency, which is where America begins to swing way to the right with Ronald Reagan. Some of the things that Reagan kind of promotes that appeals to people, things like free markets, private health care, he's going to cut taxes, he's going to grow the military. And again, this literally doubles American spending. So even though he goes into office saying, I'm going to reduce spending, I'm going to reduce government, we're going to privatize it, we're going to, kind of create all these industries outside of the government, he actually doubles spending within the government, which by the end of his term in office is going to triple the national debt. So again, Ronald Reagan is doing all this with a very short-term plan. I'm going to make people happy today. I'm going to cut taxes. I'm going to give you more money in your pocket. Spend it on whatever you want. But it's not really looking long-term at sustainability. So again, we have this very right swing into Ronald Reagan. But again, by the end of the 1980s, America finds themselves in an enormous amount of debt because of this. Now, throughout this whole entire time, we obviously still have the Cold War going on. One of the major areas we're going to see the Cold War being physically fought on is obviously in the country of Vietnam. So why is America even involved in the country of Vietnam? Why is this important to us? Well, as a country, Vietnam is not important. What is important to us is the idea of the domino theory. That Vietnam might not be important, but if Vietnam becomes communist, then Laos will become communist and Cambodia will become communist. And the next thing you know, every single country is going to fall just like a stack of dominoes. Eventually, India is going to become communist. And then literally the 2 largest countries in the world plus the Soviet Union are all going to be communist. And who's America going to be friends with? All right, so again, while Vietnam itself isn't important, it's important for us to stop the spread of communism wherever it's going. It just so happens that that country is Vietnam. Now, militarily speaking in Vietnam, it's extremely hard to be successful. And the major issue there is we're not attacking. We're not trying to win a war. We're simply trying to protect the country of South Vietnam from being invaded by North Vietnam. Right? And again, it becomes extremely complicated. Again, we're not going on the offensive. We're not conquering. We're not surrounding enemies and forcing them to surrender and taking cities. We're literally just trying to set up a perimeter around an entire country and not let anyone in, which is going to be next to impossible to do. And that's really why we see America being unsuccessful in Vietnam. China, also a communist country that we've talked about after the Civil War of 1949. What we see during this time is Mao's Cultural Revolution. And the goal is to remove the 4 olds, things like old thought, old custom, old culture, and old beliefs. He really wants to bring China into being a modern society. But the way in which he goes about this is to literally destroy Chinese history, right? Statues are destroyed. Again, really old buildings. Anything that is basically pre-1949 is eligible to be destroyed during this Cultural Revolution because in his eyes, history begins in 1949 when China becomes a communist country. So again, you just have these bands of revolutionaries going around the country, destroying everything old, destroying everything historical, and anyone who doesn't buy into this communistic idea gets sent to a re-education camp, where a lot of people never came back from, right? They just basically use it as forced labor. So again, it really pushes people into these communist ideas, which again, aren't necessarily great for everyone. Now, if you remember, at the end of the Chinese Civil War, America breaks off diplomatic relations with China. We basically pretend like China doesn't exist. The only country we talk to is Taiwan, and we just pretend like that's the real China. But finally, in 1972, Richard Nixon meets with Mao. We begin to see a little bit of trade, and by 1979, America opens up full diplomatic relations with China again. Now, we mentioned earlier this idea of détente between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. What exactly is it? It's essentially this idea of mutually assured destruction, that both sides have created treaties and are sticking to these treaties, and what it did was design a conflict between the two countries to be unwinnable. That if you attack me, I'll attack you, we'll both end up dead, and ideally nobody wants to start that war, right? Why would you start a war if everyone in your country is going to end up dead too? And again, the idea that the Cold War actually kind of chills out, it becomes less hostile because both sides have created so many nuclear weapons that it's going to be impossible to actually win a war between them. So again, we are still in that Cold War. We are still, kind of having that struggle with each other. But again, the idea of us attacking each other really diminishes by the 1970s. So much of other things that occurred during this time period, we see the emergence of computers, things like the silicon chip, transistors allow computers to be smaller, to be faster, and again, that's going to really revolutionize everything within our society. We also see people paying a little bit more attention to the environment, right? Again, there are minimal regulations about things like pollution, deforestation, air pollution. So again, you start to see governments acknowledging that these things are in fact problems and creating laws to try to solve some of those problems. It's also during this time period that we see the Chernobyl disaster. It's in the country of the Ukraine, but at that time this is part of the Soviet Union. Again, a huge nuclear leak that occurs at that power plant. In response to this, we start to see green political parties. So again, political parties that are just concentrating on the environment really begin to sprout up around the world, but specifically in European countries. Art, literature, and music all change during this time period. Again, they're a reflection of the times. Where in the 60s, maybe you see a little bit more of this revolt or revolution idea within the music. By the time we get to the 1980s, you see the emergence of things like MTV and hip-hop and consumerism really taking hold. And again, all that is kind of changing and shifting as the norms of our society change as well. So again, that is our look at chapter 29.